So we are reading Power versus Force by Dr. David Hawkins. We are on chapter 21 of the book, page number 249 of the book, and page number 50 of the PDF.
The study of pure consciousness. Various aspects of consciousness have been the subject of traditional philosophy, and expressions of consciousness as mind or emotion have been the subjects of the clinical sciences, but the nature of consciousness itself has never been clinically studied in any comprehensive sense. In medicine, the presumption that consciousness is no more than a function of the brain is reflected in such statements as the patient regained consciousness. This routine, narrow depiction has assumed consciousness is a mundane physical phenomenon, a self-evident priority for experience about which nothing more needs to be said.
So basically, when you look at it from raw scientific perspective, the brain is the center of consciousness. If the brain is not active, consciousness is not there. But this is not a fact. This can be very clearly understood by mainly people who've had near-death experiences, where when they experience something and they come back, they have a very rich experience in spite of the fact that they have been declared dead. Okay. Now, there is a book by Dr. Eben Alexander. I forget the name of the book anyway. But in that, he's a brain surgeon. And he comes back and his doctors, his colleagues, they say that you could not have had any experience because there was pus inside your brain and it could not have been functioning. But he came back and said that he had a very rich experience even in that state of consciousness. I mean, in that state of being where his body was totally laid up. And one thing is there that he could not wrap his head around that experience that he had. But when he went to the Monroe Institute, when he went into these expanded states of focus 15 and 21, etc., that is when he could understand what was the experience he had, because he experienced it again when he went into those states of consciousness. So what happens is that when you're looking at it from raw scientific perspective, they think that the brain is the center of consciousness, and if the brain is not there, consciousness cannot exist. But that is not a fact.
The one recurrent focus of interest in the subject has been speculation regarding what happens to man's consciousness at death. Does the power of life and awareness arise from a physical basis? Does the body sustain conscious life? Or is it the other way around, the power of life sustains the body? Because the way the question is asked will be defined by the questioner's preconception of causality. The level of the questioner will predetermine the nature of the awareness of answer. Each questioner will derive an answer representative of his level of consciousness.
So again, whenever you are asking a question, you will naturally be operating. Everyone operates at a certain level of consciousness, right? So their perception also moves or operates from that particular level of consciousness. So naturally, they will ask the question and perceive the answer at that same level of consciousness. So if you ask the same question to different people, you are liable to get different answers depending on their level of consciousness. So where are we operating from? What is the state of consciousness that we are operating from starts becoming very, very important.
To the materialistic scientist, the question will appear nonsensical, a fruitless exercise in tautology. To those at the other pole, the enlightened, the question will seem comical, and the limited perception it reveals will elicit compassion. The common man might take on faith, the authority of either, or of conventional religious teachings to answer the question.
So naturally, if you're operating from the materialistic perspective, something which is not material cannot exist. So they will always say that the brain is the center of consciousness. For a person who's operating at higher levels of consciousness, the realization is already there that the physical is dependent on the etherical, right? And this is something that we've been seeing in Hands of Light also, where very clearly Barbara Brennan says that first everything is formed at the etheric level, at the energy field level, and then it comes into the physical level. So naturally, from that level of consciousness or that level of awareness, we would consider that the physical is dependent on the etheric, right? So naturally, consciousness cannot be dependent on physicality. So depending on where you're operating from, what is the level of consciousness that you're operating from, you will perceive also in that particular way.
All discussions of life, death, and the final fate of consciousness must necessarily reflect differences of context. The reciprocal of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, is I am, therefore I think, because thinking takes place as form. Descartes is correct. That which has form must already have existence in order to have form. I am is a statement of awareness, witnessing that the capacity for experience is independent of form.
So again, Descartes was a very famous philosopher and he's written a lot of books, right? So his most famous statement is this, that I am, therefore I think. That means he's saying, because I exist as a physical being, therefore I think, right? But the other side is also very, very prominent. But then Descartes takes it as this only, that I am, therefore I think.
Descartes implies that consciousness is only aware of itself when it assumes form, but the enlightened throughout history have disagreed, customarily stating that consciousness is beyond form and is indeed the very omnipotent matrix out of which form arises. Modern physicists concur, for example, David Bohm, in his concept of an enfolded and unfolded universe.
So again, the same discussion, right? The enlightened always say that the physical depends on the subtle, and the materialists always will say that the form is the subtle is dependent on the form. So David Bohm had this concept of the enfolded and the unfolded universe. So you could also equate it with potential energy and kinetic energy. So potential energy is enfolded and kinetic energy is unfolded. Why? Kinetic energy has power. You can do things with kinetic energy. But with potential energy, the potential of moving stuff, the potential of energy is there, but it does not actually move stuff. For example, coal has potential energy. Steam has kinetic energy, right? So in the same way, the enfolded and the unfolded, what David Bohm talks about.
Without consciousness, there would be nothing to experience form. It could also be said that form itself, as a product of perception with no independent existence, is thus transitory and limited, whereas consciousness is all-encompassing and unlimited.
So again, form has a limitation. It doesn't have a capacity to expand. It is stuck. It is in a box, right? This is again what we talk about. We have to get out of our belief systems. So the form is a box, but actually the form is not limited. But in our perception, when we look at form, it starts becoming limited. Whereas conscious awareness, your thought, How can you limit your thought? Right? How can you limit your imagination? There is no limit to your thought. There's no limit to your imagination. So that means it's unlimited, and it can connect to the infinite, whereas form cannot. It is connected to infinite, but in our perception, it is stuck. It is in the box.
How could that which is transitory, with a clear beginning and ending, create that which is formless, all-encompassing and omnipresent? However, if we see that the notion of limitation itself is merely a product of perception with no intrinsic reality, then the riddle solves itself. Form becomes an expression of the formless. Ontologically, consciousness is an aspect of isness, beingness, and is implicit in man's definition of himself as human. Humanness is only one expression of beingness.
Okay, so when I'm being, right, I can express myself in multifolded ways. But when you're looking at form, it can express itself only in one way. So over here, he says the implicit, what is implied, and the explicit, what is available for us to see. So the form is explicit, right? We can see it. But implicit is the consciousness, because consciousness can exist in as anything, right? So again, very clearly over here, when perception, if what it says here very clearly is, however, the notion of limited self is merely a product of perception with no intrinsic reality, then the riddle solves itself, right? So if the form cannot experience or explain the formless, then how can it be creating the formless? So this clearly implies that the formless creates the form.
What is the meaning of ontologically?
It's over here in the book, it says metaphysically, not ontologically. Okay, so it seems that in the PDF they've changed it.
Okay.
It says that ontological relating to the branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
The operation of consciousness in human beings is the greater subject of our study. Although consciousness itself may be intangible, it is intrinsic to all human behavior. For purposes of this work, the problem is how to clinically explicate the connection between consciousness and behavior in an accurate and meaningful way that can be scientifically studied. Fortunately, kinesiology categorically demonstrates the physical expression of sentience through the instantaneous reaction of the body to events experienced within consciousness. The technique affords us an elegant methodology with an unmistakably established endpoint that can be calibrated, documented, and reproduced experimentally.
So basically what they're saying is that kinesiology allows us to make a connection between the physical and the metaphysical, so that we can create a bridge between the two.
Characteristics of pure consciousness. Our vision of consciousness is linked with our concept of self. The more limited the sense of self, the smaller is the parameter of experiencing. Restricted paradigms of reality are global in their effects. As an example, our studies of the poor have made it evident that poorness is not just a financial condition, but that the poor are poor in friendships, poor in verbal skills, poor in education, poor in social amenities, poor in resources, poor in health, and poor in overall level of happiness. Poorness then can be seen as a quality characteristic of a limited self-image, resulting in a paucity of resources. 2. It is not a financial condition, but a level of consciousness. The energy of that level of awareness calibrates at about 60.
So what he is saying over here is that it is anything that you're visualizing, anything that you're perceiving can be calibrated to the level of consciousness that you are dealing with. So that the level of consciousness was posted on the group. So if you see level, if he's saying the level at 60, it is between apathy and grief, right? So the basic, the way, if you think you're poor, then you will be poor, right? So what is the level of consciousness that you're operating with? That determines where you're operating from, right? It doesn't mean a very poor person, when you talk from the prospect of finances, can be a very happy person because the person doesn't need finance. Now, suppose you're sitting in a forest somewhere, then what are you going to do with money? What are you going to do with gold? It is useless for you, right? So resources also, you cannot determine what resource makes you poor or what resource makes you rich. It depends on the circumstances. But the attitude of poorness can be calibrated. Okay, so he's saying that the attitude of poorness calibrates at 60, which is definitely below 200. So it automatically puts you on the left side of the grid.
The identification and therefore experience of self could be limited to an identification of self as one's physical body. Then, of course, we might well ask, how does one know that one has a physical body? Through observation, we note that the presence of the physical body is registered by the senses. The question follows, what is it that is aware of the senses? How do we experience what the senses are reporting? Something greater, something more encompassing than the physical body has to exist in order to experience that which is lesser. That something is mind. A person identifies with his body because his mind is experiencing his body. Patients who have lost sizable portions of their bodies report that their sense of self remains undiminished. Such a person will say, I am still just as much as me.
Okay, so again, what does this mean? That if something is observing something, then that thing exists without that thing that it is observing, because it's being able to observe it. So if the mind can observe the physical body, that implies that the mind is not the body, right? So the mind doesn't exist in the body because it's able to observe the body. And a very good example here, when someone loses a limb, the sense of self does not diminish. So that means that that self, or that beingness, is not dependent on the physical body.
The question then arises, how does one know what is being experienced by the mind? By observation and introspection, one can witness that thoughts have no capacity to experience themselves, but that something both beyond and more basic than thought experiences the sequence of thoughts, and that its sense of identity is unaltered by the content of thoughts.
So again, we come back to the position where I keep using this example, where we ask someone to draw a straight line on a board, right? Now we ask the question, does this line have energy or not? But the question before that is that how did the line come into existence? So we had to think of it. But now the question comes, where did the thought to draw the line come from? Right? So this is what he's talking over here, where the thoughts can come from the mind. But where did the thought come? It came from a deeper state of ourselves, and which is what we are talking about in the workshops. The bigger guy, the big guy. The small guy is the mind, right? Which is also connected with ego. But the big guy is where everything comes from. So that is where beingness starts to come from.
What is it that observes and is aware of all the subjective and objective phenomena of life? It is consciousness itself that is resonated as both awareness and experiencing. Both are purely subjective. Consciousness itself is not determined by content. Thoughts flowing through consciousness are like fish swimming in the ocean. The ocean's existence is independent of the fish. The content of the sea does not define the nature of the water itself. Like a colorless ray, consciousness illuminates the object witnessed. Thus, its traditional association throughout world literature is with light.
So now again, when you look at it from the Vedantic principle, Nagarji keeps talking about the Adhar, on which everything exists. So it's very much like the screen in a movie theater, which is the Adhar of the picture coming, right? So we are able to observe the picture because it's playing on that screen. So that screen could be equated with the conscious awareness, and what is playing on the screen. Because the screen is there, we can see what is playing. If the screen wasn't there, we could not be seeing what was there. So the Adhar, or the thing that it rides on, I mean awareness rides on, is consciousness.
Identification solely with the content of consciousness account for the experience of self as limited. In contrast, to identify with consciousness itself is to know that one's actual self is unlimited. When such circumscribed self-identifications have been surmounted so that the sense of self is identified as consciousness itself, we become enlightened.
So this is what we are all striving for, that oneness, that wholeness, that enlightenment, where our level of consciousness merges with that supreme level of consciousness. So this is what we are working on in all the programs, all the book readings, everything, to make ourselves more and more aware of that state of beingness, that state of consciousness.
This consciousness means Chetna, is that right?
Yeah, it's like Chetna, absolutely. From the Vedantic principle, it will be Chetna.
One characteristic of the experience of pure consciousness is the perception of timelessness, or timelessness of perception. Consciousness is experienced as beyond all form and time and seen as everywhere equally present. It is described as isness or beingness, and in the spiritual literature, I amness. Consciousness does not recognize separation, which is a limitation of perception. The enlightened state is a oneness in which there is no division into parts. Such division is only apparent from a localized perception. It is only an accident of a point of view.
So again, oneness, right? When we go into that wholeness state, that oneness state, then time and space cease to exist. And this is something that when people are attending the excursion workshop or in the gateway voyage, you actually experience the timelessness, where you can slow down and speed up time, right? Because you're inching closer to that oneness. So in Focus 15, people who have experienced it, you can actually experience that time seems to start getting still. Or suppose a task would take 15 minutes, you are finishing it in 5 minutes time in the normal time space continuum, right? Which is literally speaking impossible, but it starts to happen. So when we start shifting our state of consciousness, a shift into timelessness also starts to happen, where time, the perception of time starts to shift. Okay, and of course, when we are getting into those states, you actually do not feel your body anymore. So a state of oneness starts coming. You actually experience this beingness. What is saying the isness? You actually start experiencing the isness in your normal waking consciousness state.
Niket, this happens even during meditation, right?
Yeah, so when we are talking about the workshops, you're taken into very, very deep states,
Okay.
very fast, right?
Okay.
And a normal person who's never meditated also starts experiencing these things in the
All right.
workshops.
Okay.
And you experience it very deeply. It's people who've meditated for decades don't experience it, and in the programs you experience it.
All right. Thank you.
Similar descriptions throughout the history of thought with the studies of William James, as reported in the famous Gifford Lectures. The experience of consciousness itself he described as rare, unique, ineffable, and beyond mind. A thought-free state of knowingness, complete, all-inclusive, with neither need nor want, beyond the limitation of experiencing a merely individualized personal self.
So again, when we are going into that oneness, a state of no thought, a state of stillness starts to come in, right? Where if you're speaking, but you're not thinking and speaking. Normally what happens is we are thinking and then we are speaking, right? But when you go into these states of oneness, there is no thought involved. You're just speaking, right? And whatever needs to come out automatically starts to come out. This is something that most people, when they have done the excursion also, even just after 2 exercises, they experience that state of no thought, where you start becoming more present. Most of the time, what is happening with us is either we are in the past or in the future. We hardly spend any time in the present. But when you go into these states of consciousness, you start becoming more present. You start connecting with your beingness, your isness. You start just being. Okay, that shift starts to take place.
Another attribute of pure consciousness is cessation of the ordinary flow of thoughts or feelings, a condition of infinite power, infinite compassion, infinite gentleness, infinite love. In this state, self becomes self with a capital S. There is an accompanying recognition of the very origin of the capacity to experience self as self. This awareness of self as self is the culmination of the process of eliminating limited identifications of self.
So normally we are very limited in our perception of ourselves, right? But when you go into these expanded states, you experience self as the big S, not as the small s, right? Also, when you go into these states, in fact, one of the participants was sharing that in focus 12, if he's operating at focus 12, he finds it literally impossible to get angry. So what he started doing is whenever he's speaking to his people in his organization, he goes into focus 12 and speaks to them. So the way that he's communicating totally shifts. Why? Because his level of consciousness has shifted. So that compassion, that ability to love, that ability to perceive starts to get enhanced, right? He's operating at a higher state of consciousness when he is doing that.
The steps necessary to be taken to facilitate awareness of self as consciousness have been well detailed historically. Numerous techniques and behaviors have been prescribed to facilitate removal of obstacles to expanded awareness. These can be found in the practice of various spiritual disciplines. The one process common to all such teachings is the progressive elimination of the identification of self as finite.
So again, the more we start becoming selfless, the more we start becoming holistic, right? The more we stop identifying with ourself. So selfishness, self-satisfaction, all those things start taking a backseat as you start evolving in the levels of consciousness, because wholeness starts to come. Your ability to serve others start to get enhanced rather than serving yourself. So the way that you're perceiving things, that itself starts to take a shift when we are going into these higher states of consciousness.
Enlightenment is said to be relatively rare, not so much because of the difficulty of following the necessary steps thereto, but because it is a condition of interest to very few, particularly in modern society. If we were to stop 1,000 people in the street and ask them, what is your greatest ambition in life? How many would say to be enlightened?
So again, most people are materialistically driven. They're driven with selfishness, right? They're driven with looking after themselves to enhance their standard of living, right? How many people are really looking at to enhance their level of conscious awareness, their consciousness? Very, very few.
Contemporary recognition of higher consciousness. The growing level of interest in consciousness as a scientific subject was recently evidenced by the first international conference on the subject, entitled Towards a Scientific Basis of Consciousness, held at the University of Arizona Health Sciences Center in Tucson, Arizona on April 12th to the 17th, 1994. This was an international interdisciplinary convocation of impressively credentialed scholars. However, among the numerous eminent presenters and the wide range of highly specialized subjects dealt with, there was little inquiry beyond rational, materialistic explanations of consciousness as a purely physical phenomenon.
So even in spiritual circles, consciousness is treated as a physical phenomenon. It's all related to materialism, right? But when we really get into real conscious awareness, it cannot be materialistic, because you step out of the self, you step out of the material world, you start getting into the, again, expanded states of consciousness. So you're not going to be connected with what is materially happening with you. As soon as we start, so if you really see very highly spiritual people, they're really not concerned about what is materially happening around them, right? They will transcend the materialism. But again, in this conference, it was all about materialism.
In fact, approaches to the subject of consciousness are as varied as human experience itself. We have cited many of the cutting-edge insights of modern inquiry into this issue in passing. It may be helpful to review the evolution of contemporary thought on this matter in order to more dearly proceed to our own conclusions.
So again, it is very important to contemplate, right? What is our experience? We have knowledge, we have information, but what is our experience? When we start contemplating, including both, that is when we will become, it will be wisdom for us, right? So what is our understanding? What is our experience? Starts becoming very much more important than anyone else's experience or anyone else's explanation. Because until we've experienced it for ourselves and actually understand what we are experiencing, we will not really understand what is consciousness all about.
The presence of some variety of consciousness is ordinarily considered to be the distinguishing characteristic of that which is living as opposed to that which is non-living. Life is the expression of consciousness in the observable or experiential world of form. But the totality of human experience attests that consciousness is both manifest and unmanifest. The awareness of consciousness within form is common. The awareness of pure consciousness beyond form is exceptional.
So again, so consciousness exists in the formed state and in the unformed state. But to be able to perceive it in the unformed state, we need to raise our level of consciousness to that level of consciousness in which that formless state exists. And unless we do that, for us, it is not possible to actually experience.
This experience of pure consciousness itself, devoid of all content, has been consistently reported throughout human history. Always the reports have been the same. Many who attained that state became the great teachers of history and have profoundly influenced human behavior. Such beings, in the course of their few short years, have been capable of creating a realization by millions of people over millennial periods of the contextual significance of existence. Because of these teachings have not concerned the material world as experienced through the senses, they have been labeled spiritual.
So very clearly, right, all the great religions which were formed by people who had a phenomenal experience. Now, William Bullman says that they either had an NDE or they had an out-of-body experience, right? So you'll say Jesus saw the burning bush, Moses saw the burning bush, Buddha got enlightened under the Bodhisattva tree, right? So some kind of a light, some kind of an enlightenment takes place, or that lighting takes place when you're going into these states of consciousness. When that happens, you start seeing things in a different perspective altogether, and that is what creates the shift in you. And once you have experienced that, then you cannot turn it back, right? And those people become great masters and great teachers. This is also a phenomenon that is experienced, right, in the Gateway Voyage, etc., where people with closed eyes actually perceive a bright light. And some of the participants have actually shared in the sharing that we open our eyes to see whether someone has put a spotlight or not, right? But when they close their eyes, the bright light is again there. So where is that light coming from? It is that state of consciousness that you are able to perceive that light, which is there always, but we can't perceive it because we are not vibrating at that particular frequency. We're not vibrating at that particular level of consciousness.
Before the recent interest of scientists in the subject, the study of consciousness was exclusively the concern of spiritual teachers and their students. But in the last 20 years, the considerable interest of numerous theoretical physicists has turned, as we have seen, to the correlation between advanced theoretical physics and the non-material universe.
So again, what he says over here, the advanced theoretical physics. Okay, so that means the physical physics, and the theoretical physicists, they did experiments in their head, right, which could not be done at the physical level. Now, when you're looking at quantum physics, etc., they are attempting to connect the physical with the non-physical, which is coming into the realm of spirituality.
The deepening of popular cultural focus since the 1960s created a receptive audience for spin-offs of this exploration in such books as Brighoff Kapra's The Tao of Physics, Shambhala 1976, and Robert Ornstein's The Psychology of Consciousness, W. H. Freeman and Company 1972. Now, classics. The occurrence of higher states of consciousness, traditionally thought to be extremely rare, grows more common as the M field of the new paradigm spreads. Recent surveys indicate 65% of respondents report having had experiences previously categorized as spiritual.
So what is the M field? He's talking about the morphogenic field. So as more and more people are experiencing these experiences, more and more people are constantly experiencing it, right? So Rupert Sheldrake coined the term the morphogenic field, where he said that if someone has, they did experiments with the maze, right? And they found that if the maze, if a rat has gone through a maze, and when they put the next rat in, he finds it easier to go through the maze. And if they put another rat after that, he finds it even easier. They also found the same thing with the crossword puzzle. The Times Magazine crossword puzzle was very popular at one time. And if a crossword puzzle had not been published, the time taken by a person to solve it was X, let's say. And if it was published and then the person was asked to solve it, the time taken may have been X by 2, right? So what happened? The information to be able to solve that puzzle was in the morphogenic field, and it got downloaded by the rest of the people. So it said over here, in a recent survey, 65% of the people have had some kind of a spiritual experience. So as we are evolving, right, more and more people are having spiritual experiences.
Because science is by its very nature concerned only with observable phenomena, it has never been attracted to spiritual concepts as a subject for consideration, despite the fact that many great scientists throughout history have personally testified to subjective experiences of pure consciousness occurring in the course of and frequently crucial to their work.
So what are these scientists saying, right? The capacity to understand an experiment, or the creation of an experiment, or the birthing of an idea came from somewhere else. It did not come from their own mind. It was a download which took place, right? And most of the really advanced thinkers, scientists, have been very, very spiritual people. In fact, this was something which was very funny. Joe McMonaghan shares this story where when the Americans found that the Russians are using psychic spies to garner information of strategic assets of the Americans started a cell, right, in which Joe McMonaghan was a part of the cell. He was actually labeled 001 remote viewer of the USA, right? Now, the Russians also had a team, and after the Cold War ended, the Russians invited the Americans to visit them. Now, in Russia, the point there is that religion could not be followed. If anyone was following any religion, they were prosecuted. But when Joe and the team went to visit them, they found they were more spiritually inclined than the Americans. Okay, he talks about this in a book, The ESP Wars. It's a very nice read as to how the ESP wars actually took place and what was the misconception in both the sides. So it turns out that both the sides were thinking that the other side was using psychics, so they started using psychics, right? So again, over here, very clearly it says, right, that great scientists also had these experiences and they had downloads which resulted in all the development that is taking place, that took place or is taking place.
But the exploding field of nonlinear dynamics provoked curiosity and commentary regarding the nature of existence and consciousness itself, expressed in such books as Does God Play Dice? Mathematics of Chaos by Ian Stewart. The new concept of a science of wholeness became the subject of popular works such as Looking Glass Universe and Turbulent Mirror by Briggs and Peat. Recently, astronomers, mathematicians, brain surgeons, and neurologists, as well as physicists, have been caught up in a tide of enthusiasm about the significance of the New Age discoveries. We have frequently pointed out that man is unable to observe or recognize an event until there is a prior context and language for naming the event.
So again, we think that we see with our eyes, but actually the image that we are seeing is being created maximum by the brain using prior information, right? So this is what he's saying, that it pointed out that man is unable to observe or recognize an event until there is a prior context and a language for naming the event. So if something is beyond your capacity to perceive, it is not in your culture to perceive something, you will not perceive it. So again, the Magellan effect. When Magellan went to West Indies, the natives could not see the ship because in their conception, such a huge ship which could accommodate so many people could not float on the water, right? So they could not see the ship. So until we have a context, we cannot perceive something. And this also happens when people are going into these altered states, they see black, there's nothing. Why? Because the normal mind, the normal consciousness does not have a context to relate with that state of consciousness. And as you start becoming used to that state, then things start to manifest and happen.
This inability, called paradigm blindness, is the direct consequence of a limitation of context. Thus, it was that the extension of the new intellectual substructure pervading the physical sciences only slowly created the potential for new views and approaches in the human sciences, such as psychology.
So again, as we grew, paradigm shifts started to take place.
Although Abraham Maslow long ago discussed peak experiences, the mainstream literature of psychology never addressed the subject of consciousness itself, with the exception of such classics as The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James Long, the standard scientific work on the psychology of consciousness as spiritual experience. Eventually, transpersonal psychology went beyond the bounds of experimental and clinical psychology to investigate those aspects of human experience which were purely subjective. Unusual experiences or abilities, once discontinued as hoax or hallucination, finally became the subject of parapsychology, legitimating experimental attempts to verify experiences such as extrasensory perception.
Yeah. So again, because science could not actually explain certain things that were happening, or people could not explain it, they started terming it, like the witch hunts which took place and all that stuff. But now we are coming to understand there is science behind whatever is happening with extrasensory perception, with spoon bending, for example, being able to predict stuff precognition, remote viewing, out-of-body experiences, NDEs, all these things are becoming normal terms now. If I spoke of an out-of-body experience 20 years back, people would think I'm crazy, right? But now many people are hearing that term. So they are being able to understand that term because it's come into normal language also.
The field of psychiatry originally arose from the attempt to address the tangible etiology of the intangibles in human behavior and disease. Psychiatry, as a branch of medicine, concerned itself with pathology. Therefore, it dealt almost exclusively with the lower levels of consciousness and their neurophysiologic correlates. Consciousness as such remained outside the paradigms of psychiatry.
So basically, medicine was only dealing with the physical. They were not looking at the metaphysical, right? And this is again something which is happening, that many people who are considered mad are not psychotic. They are having a spiritual experience, but the paradigm to understand that spiritual experience is not there with the normal doctors. So they don't realize that a person is actually having a spiritual experience. And this, many times what happens, in fact, we had a case over here, someone told her that you are having a Kundalini experience and all that, and stop all spiritual practices, otherwise you're going to have a problem, right? Ultimately, it turned out it was only a case of grounding. Proper grounding was not taking place. Proper thinking process was not there, which was resulting in the problem. But as soon as it was put into the right perspective, things started to improve, right? So again, understanding these things become very, very important.
In medicine, physicians who worked from a larger paradigm of the healing process and included non-traditional modalities in their therapeutic approaches became known as holistic practitioners, an appellation that at first carried distinct overtones of unprofessionalism among the ranks of the medical establishment. But the contributions of pioneering individuals in this field, especially in such areas as recovery from heart attacks or the use of prayer to speed up recuperation in surgical patients, demanded serious recognition.
Okay, so there's a lot of research. There's a book by Larry Dossey where they did a research where they had two groups of people, and one group was being prayed for. They didn't even know who the person was. They were just praying for them. And there was another group who was not being prayed for. They found there was a distinct difference in the level of recuperation or recovery or healing in the patients who were prayed for, right? So there's a lot of data now where when you pray for someone, the healing becomes better. We are seeing this in our healing group also, where anyone is asking for a healing, we distinctively see that the results start coming, right? For healing of various items, etc., etc. I don't know how many of you are in the healing group, but we see miracles, small miracles happening every day.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross brought the attention of the professions as well as the public to the phenomena of dying and near-death experiences as reported by patients. Out-of-body experience also eventually became a relatively common subject, as surgical patients reported out-of-body adventures in which they witnessed their entire operations and heard everything said in the operating room.
So Elizabeth Ross Kubler is one of the, he did the maximum amount of research on death and dying at one point in time. In fact, he associated with Robert Monroe also, and it resulted in actually the Lifeline program being created, where we actually go into altered states and recovered souls and heal stuff, etc. He also created with Robert Monroe a series, a CD set series, which actually has 15 CDs, which are meant for the people who are going to die, right? So it was mainly meant for the hospec people who were in hospec, and they were on the way of death, to make them experience what happens after life, so that when they die, the transition becomes smooth. And also there was in those 15 CDs, there are CDs or meditations for people who are giving care to the people who are dying, right? So death and dying, previously a taboo subject, is coming into the mainstream now, but it has still not fully coming. In Tibetan culture, they have a book called the Book of the Living and Dying, where clearly the Rinpoche says that they prepare for death. They prepare for it, right? So over here, what is happening? This phenomenon, which, and especially with, this recovery things where they give those pads which they put on the chest of the people and they recover. So many people are having these out of body experience or near death experiences now. So people have to start paying attention to them, because so many people are experiencing this, that they're witnessing their operation, or they've come back, they went somewhere and then they come back. And what has been found is that there's a very big shift which takes place in the nature of the person, the way that person starts perceiving things before and after death.
Thelma Moss became well known for her work with Kirlian photography of energy fields, such as those around fingertips. Her photographs of the energy body of a full leaf remaining after it had been cut in two are well known. Finally, even acupuncture has gained a place of some respect in the American health field, with many physicians learning the technique despite the fact that traditional medicine has not recognized any energies other than mechanical, electrical, or chemical.
So again, Kirlian photography. In fact, in awareness now, we've got 3 or 4 methods of photography. We also have the GDV, which actually works on the exact same principle of the Kirlian photography. You have to put your fingers and the picture comes. Based on that, full diagnosis can be made. We've also been taking a lot of aura photographs where psychological issues, where you are, it acts like a mirror for you, right? You can actually start perceiving and understanding yourself better by using these techniques.
Holistic approaches operate from a different context of the nature of human consciousness than does traditional medicine, with emphasis on healing rather than treating.
So this becomes very important, right? Holistic medicine always wants to create homeostasis in the body system, which allows the body to heal itself. Whereas allopathic medicine, or the normal medicine that we now treat as normal medicine, wants to heal using chemicals, etc. But if the body is not ready to heal, the medication will not do anything, right? So it is very important to create a platform inside the body which allows the body to heal itself. This is something that we are finding very, very importantly in biofield tuning, where I'm finding that if the Earth star and Sun star are not aligned properly, healing will not take place. It's very difficult to heal if those two things are not in place, right? Today only I was doing a biofield tuning for one person, and she's been having medication for years and it was not working. We've done a few sessions for her and she herself tells me that dawai lagne lag gaya. What does that mean? That the medication has started to work and she's feeling better. What have we done? We've just created a field or space for the healing to take place in the body. That's all that we have done, nothing more than that. And the healing starts to take place. So over here, it's very clearly says that traditional medicine does and emphasize is on healing rather than on treating. So we are not treating, we are creating a space for the healing to take place.
And though their connection with the theoretical breakthroughs of recent decades may not appear explicit, The alternate therapies employed by holistic health caregivers, whether physicians, alternative practitioners, or lay healers, however widely they differ in their approach and method, all have one common element. All are based on techniques to influence not protoplasm as such, but an energy field which surrounds, courses through, and conditions the human body.
So again, they're talking about the biofield where everything is recorded, right? All healing will be monitored through the auric field. If the energy field is not working properly, healing will not take place. So we need to work with the biofield, which is what normal traditional healers used to do, shamans used to do. They used to heal the field and the body used to heal itself, right? This is extremely important. Yes, I am not discounting the normal allopathic medicine. When intervention is required, surgery is required, those processes are very, very good, right? Pain management also can be very good. For example, medication is also good. But ultimately, if they don't integrate and the healing is not taking place at the auric level, physically the healing will not take place very well.
Outside the medical domain, the phenomenal success of the 12-step self-help movement to which we have frequently alluded has impressively established that healing can be effected through the practice of principles of consciousness. The capacity to heal desperate conditions recognized by Jung in his work with Roland H., the first link, as we have seen in the long chain of healings that eventually became worldwide. Alcoholics Anonymous movement lay distinctly within the realm of higher consciousness. The profound spiritual experience held out as hope by Jung to Roland, very much akin to the transformations of enlightenment, was the essence of the message passed on to Bill W., the founder of AA. It is notable that Bill W. characterized AA as the language of the heart.
So again, Alcoholic Anonymous, there are 12 steps to it, which asks you certain questions. And as you start answering the questions over and over again, it creates a shift in your level of consciousness. And over here, he says that it was a language of the heart. So you were connecting, instead of logically thinking about the stuff, you started operating from the heart, right? The heart always operates holistically. The mind is where the ego operates and you become selfish. So there has to be a conjunction between the heart and the mind or the brain to really have a holistic shift in consciousness.
All these trails blazed in the pioneering of theoretical and applied human wisdom have a common point of convergence. Or perhaps it might be better said that they share a common point of origin. Bill Wilson's revelation from the depths of despair did not proceed from conceptual rationality or any other introspective focus of self, but from a leap to higher consciousness, a transport of self to a presence of infinite light and power.
So again, when we shift into higher states of consciousness, healing automatically starts to take place. Because when we shift our perspective, we shift the way that we are looking at a thing, and the entire meaning of the thing starts to change.
That this transformational experience has led to the recovery of millions is merely testimony to the power of energy fields which calibrate at 600 or more. That is the level at which there is a crossover of the experience of consciousness from form to formless.
So again, at the level of 600, phenomenal stuff starts to take place, right? I mean, I don't think any one of us is really operating at that level of consciousness all the time, but we may have peak moments when we actually hit that level and come back.
This formless power, the higher power, of the worldwide 12-step self-help movement and the basis for its millions of recoveries, is the same wellspring of power to which all these far-flung branches of intellectual exploration have been not so much thrusting forward as working their way back. It is the power of pure consciousness itself.
So again, very clearly, all healing takes place when we shift our states of consciousness. Okay, whether it's mental, physical, emotional, or spiritual, it's all a matter of shifting states of consciousness. Okay, I think we can stop here.